Grow your practice, grow your wealth, grow your impact. Find out how to spend less time in the dental chair and more time on the things you love.
Welcome to the Dental Wealth Podcast. Hey, I'm glad to have you back. Wanted to take a moment and say, first of all, thank you to all the subscribers. Thank you for listening. We are literally at this point having so many people come on every single day. It's record setting, and I want to thank you. Hey, share this with a friend. Let them know. So, keep the momentum going. Glad you're listening. Glad you're staying consistent. I'm going to keep sharing content on here that can help you think in a different way, that can move the needle, move the business. And today is no different. So today what I want to do is I want to talk about banking for a moment. And so when I talk about that, what I want to talk about is when you should be taking money from a bank. Here's a great question for you. Just because the bank will lend you money, does that mean you should take it? And the answer is no, absolutely not. And so it's one of the things that happens. And we saw this happen in 2008. And we see it happen in 2007 and 2006. And we assume that. We assume that if a bank says okay, so if a bank signs on the dotted line, says, hey, here's your loan, then they must have done the numbers. They might have looked at the risk profile. They must have known that this is a good loan. And the truth is that's not necessarily true. And so what we take this money, we go buy a building or we invest into something in our practice. By the way, if you're doctors, how hard is it to go get a bank loan? It's really, really, really simple. And the larger the bank, the more likely they are just to write your note. And what I mean by that is, listen, Bank of America or what some of these large banks, it could be a SunTrust, or it could be a large national bank, a regional bank. But when you start to get to that type size, understand they understand there are a certain amount of loans that will go bad. You guys get that, right? So those companies do know that there's a certain amount that will go bad, and you're just in a sense a statistic in that. And that's not to knock those companies, by the way. It's just to say that they do understand that with the volume that they're writing, that a certain amount will go bad, okay? Now, maybe a smaller bank is a little bit more cautious because they have to be careful in their underwriting because they, having a loan go bad, they may be more particular. But I want you to think about this idea of just because I can get a loan, does that mean I should take it? And there's different ways to look at it. And the first is just the most obvious, which is risk, which is, do we do pessimistic modeling? And even if you think about bank loans, for instance, most bank loans are done on at least the current revenues, maybe the last year or two. They're kind of looking at what happened, maybe possibly looking at a pro forma, some projections on what might happen in the practice. But they don't necessarily, let me ask you a question. How's been the economy for the last 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years? Oftentimes, the projections that are there for you might not take into account you having a 30% drop in revenue, and then what happens as a kind of a snowfall from that. What ends up happening, there's kind of a domino effect. If all of a sudden your revenues drop 30%, what would that do? And so what ends up happening is, and I'm telling you this because I see loans, people send me loans that I'm like, wow, I cannot believe someone did this. And I want to caution you on that. I want to caution you on just taking a bank loan because somebody will give it to you. Also remember that, and if you don't know this, I want you to write this part down, which is debt is less expensive, right? Debt's more risk, but it's less expensive. Equity is more expensive. So cash is more expensive. Debt is more risk. That's kind of an MBA concept, but I want you to understand that to say, look, maybe sometimes we use debt because of the fact that it's inexpensive. And it is. If you look at the interest rates on debt versus the rate of return that you could use your cash and invest your cash somewhere else, what you'll find is that, man, I could, I can go borrow money for 3, 4, 5, 6%, and then maybe finance something with that, and then use my capital, if we're being really smart, and go invest somewhere where I'm getting in my practice 30, 40%. So debt makes sense sometimes, and it makes sense if you leverage it correctly. By the way, don't go just take on a bunch of debt. But I want you to realize, yes, it can be used well, but oftentimes people don't do what's called pessimistic modeling. And I want you to do this. I want you to be, in charge of your dental wealth. I want you to look at your practice and say, am I doing pessimistic modeling? Which means, what's the worst case scenario? Like, could I afford this loan if this was to happen, that was to happen, something was to happen, a global economy move, national economy. There's a certain virus out there right now, which I'm not going to talk about, but could have some impact on the dental community, and patients going to seek care. So we start to see and say, look, these things can have an effect. What would that do? What happens if you don't have cash for the next 60, 90, 120 days? What if something was to happen? Is your disability even in place to make sure? Now, most companies make sure you have that. But what would happen as far as a disability if something was to happen from a disability standpoint? So sometimes we look at things and we think a bank, if they wrote a loan, definitely looked at every single scenario, and they didn't. They didn't look at every single scenario. And to be completely honest with you, I've seen banks write things that they really didn't know what they were doing. And I can stand by that if someone was to ever challenge me on that, because I'm telling you, I can give you example after example after example after example of banks that wrote loans that literally the bankers that wrote it did not know what they were doing. And so I caution you to say, you've got to be the CEO. You've got to be the wise one. You've got to be able to look at this and start saying, hey, do these numbers make sense? And what would happen if I have a downturn? And should I be borrowing this month? You can see it all the time when someone starts a practice. I mean, you've got people coming out of dental school getting $600,000-$700,000 loans when they already have $300,000 of student loan debt. And so think about that just for a second. Like, you're giving $600,000-$700,000 loan to a person who's never run a business, who doesn't know anything about business, right? And just handing them almost a blank check. I mean, you see it all the time. So we do know that there's a lot of risk out there. And so I want to caution you in that. I also want to caution you to think about, if I over leverage, what is the cost of that? So sometimes when we start taking out bank loans because they'll give it to us, what it does is, because most people aren't very familiar with their balance sheet and their profit and loss statement, but what ends up happening is, it all of a sudden, because they're not paying attention to the fact that it's on the balance sheet, then what ends up happening, and I'm not getting into accounting today, but to say this, is all these little equipment loans start just destroying cash flow, and they start just ripping the cash flow out of the business, because it would make sense to borrow money for a piece of equipment that then had a return, and we used the return to pay off the piece of equipment very quickly. And so that would make sense. But that's not typically what happens, is it? What typically happens is someone takes out a loan, and they take out another 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 loan. And the worst thing I've just been seeing recently is some people going into certain types of dentistry that they're not even familiar with, and taking out $250,000 loan, hoping that it's going to move the needle on their practice. And I've seen some financing on that's really scary. It's not sound fundamental financing. And to be honest with you, you wouldn't write the loan yourself. And so we have to be cautious. If we're going to build wealth, we have to understand the banks are out for the banks. And by the way, I have a lot of great people in the banking industry, great people. This is not a knock on the banking industry. Let me just make sure I make that clear. They have their things that they have to get done, and you have yours. And look, there's banks that I'm a fan of, especially in the Atlanta marketplace, that really focus on making sure doctors are taken care of and are definitely more difficult. But you have to manage your own debt. And you can't just hand it over to a bank and say, well, the bank wrote it, so then I'm good to go. There shouldn't be a problem. Because, and we saw this, by the way, happen in 2008 when people started going upside down on their home. Who did they blame? Well, they blamed the banks. And the truth is, it kind of made me frustrated at the time, because I was like, is there no owner responsibility in that? They knew they couldn't afford that payment. They were hoping their income would go enough to pay it. They were buying other things, because trust me, I was around the mortgage industry at that time. I saw it all the time, and they turned around and blamed the banks. Would you do the same? Can you do the same? See, what ends up happening is we have to take ownership. Now, The average person might blame the banks, by the way. That's fine. The average dentist might blame the banks if something goes wrong. But I'm telling you, you're not the average dentist, or you wouldn't be listening to this podcast. And so you've got to be out in front of that and saying, hey, look, as a CEO, and people are using that now to market their consulting. But the truth is I'm telling you as a CEO, need to understand the difference between equity and debt, when you should take on debt, when you should use cash. If you don't know how to do that, then someone needs to help you or will help you. Someone needs to teach you that. Not someone trying to sell you something, but someone who can help you really understand the difference between the two. There's times when you use debt and there's times when you use equity. It doesn't make sense to keep taking out equipment loans and then somebody keeps buying stuff that they don't need, or taking the money home and buying cars and things that don't make sense either. So it's very important for you to understand that oftentimes when loans are taken out, that you take on a lot of risk. They hurt cash flow. They hurt your future wealth. That's why what ends up happening is these guys refinance your loan every 10 years. And it seems like you can never, you're always extending your note. I've said on this podcast before, there's a guy in the Atlanta marketplace who basically takes your loans, stretches them all out, takes your money and shoves it into whole life insurance and says that's a financial plan, which by the way, it's not. And so, we end up in this perpetual cycle of debt. There's also another piece of this, which is the banks will cap you out. If you're someone listening to this and you're thinking, hey, I'm going to form a DSO, or I'm going to form multi-practice, and I'm going to be looking at, buying 7 locations, your biggest problem is going to be access to capital. Your biggest problem is going to be access to capital, which is why people bring private equity in. The more debt that you leverage against other things, right, the less likely a bank is willing to give you money. You might need a bank to fund your future growth. But if you're overextended and you've got debt everywhere, then what ends up happening is a lot of the times, because the banks, and I was explaining to someone this last week about this concept, is if you're a bank, if you're on the board of a bank, would you rather take, one loan and give it to somebody at, let's just say $5 million, or would you rather have 5 practices at $1 million? See, certainly you would rather spread out your risk, right? That would make more sense. So as the larger you go, the more risk you are to a bank. If something was to happen to you, that's greater risk for a bank. And at some point, the banks are going to cut you off, which is why people bring private equity in. So what happens is you've got to be strategic. When it comes to debt, you've got to be strategic. You've got to be strategic in saying, okay, first of all, just because someone by the way, don't just listen to this. Go grab your loans, grab your balance sheet. Go look at, if you don't know how to read a balance sheet, call us up. We'll help you walk through it. But get your balance sheet, pull it out, and look at what your loans are. First of all, I would encourage you to accelerate some of that debt because the money's going to get spent anyway in your business. So I would encourage you to accelerate it, but look at the balance sheet, look at the loans you have right now, and start to say to yourself, what if I lost revenues 30% tomorrow? What would happen for my ability to pay this note and payroll and my own income to pay my own mortgage and my own bills? And what would happen in this scenario? How difficult would this be to pay? And I want you to look at those and by the way, eliminate, you need to stop taking out all the little equipment loans. Stop those. Those are like car payments. They're short amortization schedules, so they destroy cash flow. For instance, what I mean by is a car payment might be $1,500, but so might a mortgage payment. So you have a $180,000 asset or something, let's call it $1,400, and you have a car payment that's $1,400. Which one makes the most sense, right? You got a $50,000 car and it's $1,400 a month. It doesn't even make sense. But because the short amortization schedule, that means that the amount how many years they'll have that loan out for, it crushes you. And if I took that $1,400 and I put it on that mortgage instead of buying that car, imagine how quickly I could pay off the home. The same thing happens with your practice. We take out these short equipment loans for things that have literally no ROI. They were sold to us by somebody who's selling a product or service. And then what ends up happening is if we didn't buy that piece of equipment that didn't have the ROI, even if it was shiny and nice and brand new, and we put that on some of our other notes, we'd find out quickly that we could accelerate our debt, therefore increasing cash flow over time and allowing us to have cash to then invest in our future growth instead of always taking out a loan. So there's strategic parts to this. And then also saying, look, every dollar in debt that I put out somewhere else is another dollar that the bank won't lend me for maybe future expansion. So we have to be careful, and say, hey, listen, when I get to that place, I might be cut off. So I don't really start wanting to use leverage on this. I might end up using equity. So there's a balance in this. And you say, well, Eric, this sounds overly complicated. That's why at Tower Leadership, we have Capital Investment Advisory Service. We can walk you through this, or maybe you have somebody else in your life that can walk you through this, but you need to have this down. If you're going to create wealth, if you're going to create true wealth, if you're going to really get after this stuff, you have to understand the difference between debt and equity. You have to be smarter than the banks. You have to be ahead of the banks. You have to be ahead of smarter than your investment guy. You have to be smarter than your accountant. And that doesn't mean you have to know everything they know. It just means that you know what their strategy is, what they're trying to do, so that you know how to make the decisions. There's a reason why an MBA, when you go get an MBA, you learn accounting, but you don't learn to be an accountant. You learn statistics, but you're not trying to be an actuary. Does that make sense? And so what ends up happening is you as a MBA, as a CEO, you're acting in the role of an MBA. In that situation, then what you need to do is you need to learn some accounting. You need to learn financial tools, i.e., I need to know how to leverage capital. I need to learn how to run teams. There's so many things that we talk about in this podcast, but you need to learn those things, because if you really want to get ahead, you can't hand that stuff off to somebody else. Oftentimes someone has a bias. They're trying to sell you something. They're trying to get you into a product. They get paid to do that. And so you've got to be the one to be able to sit. Imagine yourself for a moment, close your eyes. Think about yourself in this boardroom, right? And then in this boardroom, you have maybe your investment advisor there, and you have an accountant there, and you've got your bank there, and you've got maybe some team leads there, right? And so in a sense, you've built this executive committee, and each person's giving you advice on what they think you should do. And everyone, maybe your lawyer's there too, and everyone's giving you advice. And you as the CEO have enough knowledge base to where you can say, I get where you're coming from, but we're not going to do that. And then you can listen to the table, but based on what they're trying to get you to do, what the best decision is. Now that might sound overcomplicated to some of you listening to this. You might go, Eric, I'm so far from being there. That's why you got to listen to podcasts like this, and that's why you got to get involved in this education. I'm telling you, it's an important piece of this. But the first step is just don't worry about. I just want you to kind of have that image, but to go back and grab your balance sheet, grab your financial statements, grab your balance sheet, look at your debt. And then let's make some action items around your debt, right? Can we reduce this debt? Why did we take out this debt? Did we need that much debt? Did it make sense? And by the way, it might make sense. And your loan might make perfect sense. By the way, if you took out a loan to get into a dental practice and you made a strong ROI, it probably made a lot of sense. The equipment loan on the piece of equipment that you rarely use that has no ROI, probably maybe not. So we go back and look at some things, and instead of using cash, we ended up taking out debt, but then we took that money home and we bought something we maybe didn't need. We're business owners first, and so we put that money back in the business. So start with that action item. Get familiar with your debt. If your revenues drop, could you handle it, right? Can you take it to the next level? Did this debt really help you grow? Did it really leverage? What's the ROI? Did it make sense? Will I need debt in the future? Will I need to be able to leverage this? Can I leverage some cash instead of debt next time? Should I be putting money aside? These are the questions that great CEOs and dental owners ask. These are smart questions, and the smartest people ask the smartest questions. So I'd start with those. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this. As always, subscribe. Make sure you're always tuned into this. This is stuff you should be listening to all the time. What happens when you listen to podcasts like this is you're not going to get everything I say right now. Some of you are going to hear this and 80% of it did it make sense to you? And some of you will get 110% of it, right? But you need to understand is what happens is the conversation changes over time. And the more you hear things, there's things I'm always educating myself. So there's some things that I'll hear and I'll go, maybe I wasn't in the place to hear that yet. And I will come back and I will hear it and hear it and hear it until I am at that place. So, but what ends up happening is stores in your brain, the information stores back there. So when you're at a place to actually make the decisions, you'll be surprised how recall happens and you'll be able to pull the information. So just because you didn't take notes on everything, like maybe if you didn't get this whole podcast, listen to it again and listen to it again, share it with a friend, talk about it with a friend, right? Talk about it with your banker, talk about these concepts because they're going to help you in really understanding these tools. And if you're really confused and say, look, let's jump on a phone call, let's talk through this, get on the team with one of our, call with one of our capital investment advisory, team members. We're here to help you. Like I said, but the first part was listening to this podcast. So thanks for doing it. Hey, send it to a friend. When you hear this stuff, if you know a business owner that, even though this is a dental podcast, look, if you know a business owner that you said, hey, this would be great information for Jim or Susie, and, send it along to them. Let them hear it. When we share information, then we listen to it again, we talk about it again, and it actually reinforces those concepts. And maybe that's somebody that you can talk to that will share another perspective. It's really great to talk about these concepts because they get kind of put into our banks and we can pull them later. Love to see your growth. Love to see your development. Thanks for all the subscribers. You guys have a great day. We'll talk to you soon.